Tonight's event is hosted by the Institution of Engineering and Technology. For those that don't know, we're a worldwide membership organisation with over 150,000 people in 127 countries. Our vision is to share and promote science, engineering and technology, both for people who are in the engineering and science professions and also those studying and the general members of the public. We're delighted this evening to have Dr. Richard Stallman with us to present on the subject of the danger of software patents. Richard probably doesn't need an introduction, but we'll still give him one anyway. He's the founder of the free software movement and launched the development of the GNU Linux operating system, which is used in tens of millions of computers worldwide. He's the recipient of many awards, one of which includes an honorary doctorate from the Vrije University of Brussels, which is here. So I'd just like to hand over to Dr. Stallman.
The first thing you need to do to understand the danger of software patents is to reject from your thinking the propaganda term, quote, intellectual property, unquote. That term is biased. It suggests the wrong reason for having a patent system. The only proper reason to have a patent system is to benefit society by encouraging publication of inventions. But if you start calling it a form of property, it's going to give you the wrong idea of what the whole purpose is, and that leads to bad judgments. But even worse, the term distracts people from all the specific concrete issues of patent law, because it tries to generalize about a dozen totally different laws. They're so different that even experts frequently make false statements when they use it. It's almost impossible to make any true statement about all those disparate laws that they apply that term to. The only way to understand any of those laws is to forget the others and think about whichever one it is and what that law does. If you start out by assuming it's like the others, you're going to be wrong, because they're not similar. Practically speaking, they have nothing of any significance in common. So that term will warp your thinking if you employ it in your thinking. So I decided about 7 years ago that I would never use that term again. I mention it in quotation marks to denounce it as incoherent. It's a pseudo-concept. And if you want to think clearly, you need to do that also. You will then find government activities which are based on that pseudo-concept. Of course, garbage in, garbage out. What they're doing is almost always rotten if it's based on that perverse concept. You can't make good judgments about patent law or any other law if you think about it under the rubric of a bogus concept like, quote, intellectual property, unquote. In particular, patent law and copyright law have almost nothing in common. So in this talk, I'm only going to talk about patent law. I don't even want to get questions about issues relating to copyright. They have nothing to do with this. And copyright law is nothing like patent law. So, what is a patent, basically? A patent is a government-created artificial monopoly on using an idea. And in most countries, these monopolies typically last for 20 years, which in the software field is a pretty long time. Now, in patent law, it's not a defense to have the idea on your own. You're still not allowed to use it. And the result is that software patents are a danger to every software developer. You can write a program, and then someone with a patent says, you're not allowed to write a program like that. You can't run it, you can't distribute it, and that patent holder could sue you, and in some cases could sue your users. Which means, by the way, that businesses that merely use software can be in danger as well. And that's just about every business in an advanced country. So, when people describe how the patent system works, usually they work in the patent system and they have a vested interest in it. They may be patent lawyers, or they are part of the patent office, or they work for a company helping it get patents, and therefore they want to present the patent system in a favorable light. So they will typically describe the patent system from the point of view of somebody who is trying to get a patent or has a patent. Effectively saying, think of what it would be like to have a patent in your pocket, and at any time you might pull it out and point it at somebody and say, give me your money. Wouldn't that be great? If you have no moral scruples, I suppose it might. But to make up for that bias, I'm going to describe the effects of the patent system from the other side, the side of its potential victims, namely software developers. Of course, a software patent is simply any patent whose idea can be implemented in software. So it's a patent that can forbid programs. A patent on the shape of a screw wouldn't forbid any software. So it's not a software patent. But they're not a special kind of patent. They're just the patents that happen to fall on the software field instead of falling on something else. So I'm going to talk about what it's like to develop software in a country that issues software patents, and to have to worry that at any moment somebody might pull out a patent and point it at you and say, give me your money. So suppose you are a software developer and you want to work with the patent system carefully. What could you do? You could try to make a list of all the ideas that might be seen in your program and then see if they're patented. But you can't make that list. It's impossible for you to see all the ideas that somebody else might perceive in your code. Because when you write it, you have a certain way of understanding it, which is what leads you to write the code. And if there's some other way of understanding it, you will tend not to be able to see that because your thinking is already guided along the lines of your conception of your code. For instance, to explain this with an analogy, suppose there were patents on elements of graphical designs. And suppose you draw a square. Well, you might realize that a bottom edge is one of the ideas in your square. And you could put bottom edge in your list. But you wouldn't think of bottom corner. However, if somebody had a patent on bottom corners, he could just tilt your design 45 degrees so that it looks like this and say, see, I see a bottom corner, I can sue you. So he might notice that, but you wouldn't probably, because you are used to thinking of your square oriented like this, which is the way you wanted to use it. So you won't be able to make that list. Well, you might think of getting a list of all the software patents that might conceivably affect your program. You can't do that either, because patent applications are kept secret for a time. the patent office can be considering patent applications which might result in the future in issued patents that you could get sued with, but they won't tell you now. So these potential future patents might cause you to get sued later, but you can't get a list of them. And this is not just a theoretical concern. In 1984, when the compress program was written using the LZW data compression algorithm, there was no patent on that algorithm. The author of compress found the algorithm in a journal article. That's when we thought that computer science journals existed to tell us about algorithms so that we could use them and make better software. But in 1985, a patent came out. The patent holder was cunning and did not immediately tell everybody to stop using this algorithm. Oh no, the patent holder figured it would be better to let everybody go on using it for a few years and dig their grave deeper, and then attack them. And that's what it did. A few years later, it was clear that we didn't dare use compress. So I started asking people to look for a replacement, another algorithm we could use. And somebody told me that he had developed an algorithm and also written a program, and he offered that program to the GNU project. A week or two before it was going to be released, I happened to see the New York Times patent column, which I didn't see very often. And it said that a new patent had been issued for a better method of compressing data. Uh-oh, I thought we better look at this. Sure enough, it covered the program we were about to release. That program was never used. It could have been worse, though. That patent could have come out a year later, or 5 years later. Well, eventually someone came up with the algorithm that's used in gzip, which compressed smaller and ran faster than LZW. So everybody that wanted to compress a file started using gzip. Unfortunately, there's never been a patent that came out that forbade the use of gzip. So this is a happy ending, except it's a much smaller happy ending than you might think. I'll tell you more later. So here it was in the same little subfield, twice in a row, there were programs that were developed and then a patent came and killed them. However, once the patents get issued, you can find out about them because the patents are published. So you could get a list of all the issued software patents, but it's a very big list. And unless you're going to spend all your time at it, you won't be able to keep up with that. So if you want to find the issued patents that might forbid your program that you're going to write, you will have to try to filter this tremendous list of patents, trying to find the ones that are relevant. And that can't be done reliably. Oh, there are various ways to do it, and you'll find a lot of patents, but you won't find them all. For instance, there was a patent covering natural order recalculation in spreadsheets. That's the feature where if you change a cell and you say recalculate, it'll recalculate everything in the correct order so it will all be consistent after one recalculation. And the earliest spreadsheets didn't do that because they ran in very small computers and there just wasn't room even for the most obvious features if they weren't necessary. But once computers got a little bigger, then there was room, so spreadsheets started doing this natural order recalculation. And then the patent was issued in 1982. And some years later, they started suing the developers of spreadsheets. Now, that patent didn't mention natural order recalculation. It didn't mention spreadsheets. In fact, it covered dozens of different ways you could implement topological sort. But it didn't mention the term topological sort. The title was A Method for Compiling Formulas into Object Code. There's no way that you could tell from the superficial aspects of this patent that it had anything to do with spreadsheets. But if you understood it completely, then you would see that it did. Somebody asked me for a copy of that patent, and I sent it to him. And when he received it through snail mail, he wrote to me and said, "I think you sent me the wrong patent." I had to go and double check and found out, yes, it was the right patent, because I had forgotten about this point. But on studying it, looking at what it actually says you're not allowed to do, I saw, yes, it is the patent about natural order recalculation. It's just that he didn't realize that because it doesn't say that's what it's about. So if you had looked for relevant patents because you were making a spreadsheet, you would not have found that one. You wouldn't have heard about that one unless somebody happened to mention that other spreadsheet developers were getting sued. So you can't reliably find all the relevant patents, but you'll find many of them. And then you have to figure out what they mean, because patents are written in twisted legal language and things don't mean what you think they mean. I read an Australian government study, it was in the 1980s, which concluded that if it were not for international pressure, it would be better for Australia to abolish its patent system. But because of that international pressure, Australia should merely try to make patents last a shorter period of time, be harder to get, and be narrower and weaker in effect. One of the interesting points was that engineers hardly ever look at patents because they're so hard to understand. They quoted an engineer saying, "I can't recognize my own inventions in patentees." And I've seen that this is true. There was someone named Paul Heckel, who in the 1980s developed a program to cram a lot of data into a small screen area. And then he got a couple of patents that I suppose were somehow related to his program. Now, I can't grasp what those patents cover. Once, I decided to find a simple way to describe what claim number 1 in one of those patents forbids people to do. And I was unable to come up with a shorter description than the text of that claim, which was just a few lines, but I couldn't remember it all. I couldn't get it all to stay in my head. It made too little sense, you see. Now, when Heckel first saw HyperCard, all he noticed was it wasn't anything like his program. But then his lawyer pointed out to him that the way one of those patents was written, it could be interpreted as covering HyperCard. So he made a threat against Apple. And then he made a threat against Apple's customers. And ultimately Apple settled this suit with him, and the terms of a settlement are secret, so we don't know who won, really, in practical effect. And most patent lawsuits are like that. They get settled. We are unable to tell how much patent extortion is going on. There's no way to measure it. They say, don't tell anybody what I'm doing to you. And the victims are too scared to tell. So, once I gave this talk, and Heckle was in the audience. And after I'd explained this, he jumped up and said, "That's not true. I just didn't know the full extent of my protection." Protection is one of those propaganda words that the people in favor of patents like to use, so I never use it in this context. Anyway, I said to him, "Yes, that's exactly what I said." And he didn't know what to say after that. If I had said no, he probably would have argued with me, but he didn't know how to argue with yes. So that was my experience being heckled by Heckle. So he couldn't recognize the meaning of his own patents. I couldn't understand them, and he couldn't understand them. I guess it takes a special kind of mind to understand what those patents say that we're not allowed to do. So you're going to have to, in order to figure out the practical effects of any possibly threatening patent, you're going to have a long talk with a lawyer explaining various things you might do, and he will then think about them, and after many hours and thousands of dollars, he'll tell you, if you do something in this area, you will almost certainly lose the lawsuit. If you do something in this area, there's a substantial chance you will lose the lawsuit. But if you want to be really safe, you've got to stay out of this area. But do note that there is a sizable element of chance in the outcome of any lawsuit. Based on these clear rules for doing business, what do you do next? There are three things you might do. You can try to avoid the patent, you can try to get a license for it, or you could invalidate it in court. And each of those three may or may not be possible based on various independent details of the situation. For instance, to avoid the patent, that means don't implement the idea that's forbidden. And sometimes that's easy. If it's just a particular quirky way of doing something, and you could do it some other way, then you can avoid it. For instance, I saw a patent for a somewhat faster version of the fast Fourier transform. It was around twice as fast, is what I heard. Well, most programs wouldn't care. I mean, if your program spends 1% of its time doing an FFT, but you can't use that faster method, you have to use the ordinary FFT, so it would take 2% of its time. Well, it won't make any difference to the users. They'll never notice. Fine. So you use the ordinary FFT, you avoid that patent, no problem. But sometimes, but in some cases that wouldn't work. If your program was going to run just barely fast enough using the faster algorithm, then if you use the ordinary one, it won't keep up. You have to wait a couple of years and get a faster computer, I suppose. Even that's not too hard, but then there are some ideas that are much harder to avoid. For instance, the LZW compression algorithm. gzip gave people a better way to compress files, so everybody who wanted to compress files switched to gzip. Nobody used compress anymore. But LZW is used to compress other kinds of things in other circumstances. For instance, the specifications for PostScript say that there is an operator for LZW compression and an operator for LZW decompression. Well, it didn't do us any good to have a different compression algorithm because that was incompatible. We couldn't use that to do these jobs. So what could we do? It looked like we couldn't implement the PostScript spec. Then I realized that both of the patents covering LZW were written in such a way that they didn't cover uncompression if uncompression was all you could do. So in order to infringe those patents, you had to implement compression. I also realized that people don't generally want to compress things in their printers. They only want to uncompress. So we implemented uncompression. We didn't implement compression. We didn't formally implement the spec, but it was good enough in practice for users. So we barely squeaked by. And then what about GIF files? GIF image format was defined to use LZW for compression also. Well, it didn't take long before somebody else made a PNG format, which I think stands for Pings Not GIF. And I believe it uses the gzip compression algorithm. So we said to people, please stop using GIF format, use PNG. And the users said, well, maybe someday, but the browsers don't support it. And the browser developers said, maybe someday, but the users are not asking for it. So each one was saying, we'll do it if the other one does first. And nobody was in a hurry to change. What happened here is that GIF was a de facto standard, meaning it was a language that people had learned to use to communicate in. And it's very hard to get people to change the language that they speak in. Just think, if it were easy, Belgium could solve all its problems. Just tell everybody, start speaking Hungarian, okay? And soon there'd be no political difficulty anymore. But people aren't going to want to switch to speaking Hungarian. They're going to say, well, nobody I talk with speaks Hungarian, so why should I learn? And that was the problem. When the language people use to communicate in is patented, it's a disaster. We used to, now you notice I said the two patents. There were two different US patents issued covering the LZW algorithm. They patented the same thing twice. That's not supposed to happen. The patent office is supposed to refuse to do that. But the patent examiners are under pressure to push the work through fast. So they don't have time to do a careful job. And I think they even get bonuses for how many patents they can push through. And so, yes, if there's an obvious problem, they'll look at it, but this wasn't obvious. You see, software is just mathematics. And in mathematics, the same idea can be described in different ways. And it's not obvious it's the same idea. You have to study both formulations carefully to see they're talking about the same thing. And because it wasn't obvious, the patent examiner must not have recognized that it was necessary to compare them carefully. So they issued two patents for the same algorithm to two different companies. But this isn't the only time. Remember that compression program that died before it was born? Well, that algorithm got patented twice also. Now, for a while we thought there was a safe alternative, namely JPEG. until a company came out and said, we found a patent in our collection that covers JPEG. Now, JPEG is not a de facto standard. It's an official standard issued by a standards committee. The JPEG Standards Committee asked its lawyer to study the question, and he said, I don't think that patent covers JPEG format, so who's right? I don't remember what the outcome was. I do know that this company sued the manufacturers of various products that made JPEG files. And I never found out what the outcome was. So avoiding a patent may not be easy. And it's even harder when there are lots of patents to avoid. I saw a list of all the patents covering MPEG-2 video format. There were, I think, 37 US patents in the list, and a similar number of patents from other countries. So, it can get quite difficult. Sometimes a user-level feature is what's patented. For instance, the users of the word processor Vrije once received a downgrade in the mail. The downgrade was to remove a feature that you could define abbreviations, and then when you type in an abbreviation followed by some punctuation character, the abbreviation would automatically replace itself with the expansion you defined. It turns out that in the 1980s somebody patented that and began threatening the developers of Vrije, and they tried negotiating with him, and he kept changing his demands. So eventually they decided to delete the feature, and they sent people the downgrade. But they also contacted me because they heard that Emacs had a similar feature. In fact, it had the feature before that patent was applied for, and as a result, Emacs eventually turned out to be grounds to invalidate that part of the patent. So I'm pleased to know that I've had at least one patentable idea in my life, but not pleased that somebody patented it. I'm glad we got rid of it, so it's one down and hundreds of thousands to go. And sometimes it's impossible to avoid a patent. For instance, there was a patent covering the entire field of public key encryption. And it blocked people from implementing this for about a decade, during which it was feasible to do so, and people tried. And there was no way to avoid that patent. It was too broad. It killed the whole field. So, avoiding patents is feasible sometimes, not feasible other times. If you leave out one minor feature, the users might still like your program. But when you leave out 20 or 50 minor features, it'll get to the point where every user is saying, this is inconvenient, it doesn't do what I want. The second way to cope is by getting a license for the patent, which means you go to the patent holder and say, please, I'll do anything, just let me implement this idea. And the patent holder says, well, I want you to get down on your knees and kiss my feet 5 times and pay me this much money. He doesn't have to do that. He could say, I'm going to shut you down. At one point, I got a letter from somebody whose family business was making casino games. And he had been threatened by a patent holder who was not going to offer him a license. I looked at the patent, claim 1 said something like, a network with a multiplicity of computers, each of which with support for a multiplicity of different games and capable of showing a multiplicity of game sessions at once. Which basically means you put some computers on the network, each one has some kind of window system so you can do various things at once, and you put more than one game on each computer. And that's his invention. But how did such an obvious idea get patented? Well, the patent system follows rules. And according to their rules, that's not obvious. You see, they think that if there is a machine that can do a certain thing once, and somebody else designs a machine that can do that n times, we call that a for loop, but they call it an invention. If there is a machine that can do A, and there's a machine that can do B, and somebody makes a machine capable of doing either A or B, we call that an if-then-else statement, but they call it an invention. So according to their rules, that wasn't considered obvious. The fact that every programmer would call it obvious, or every system administrator would call it obvious, they don't care about that. They have a prepared response. You're too close to the subject, and so of course it looks obvious to you when you try to judge it. In any case, absurd as this patent was, there was no help I could offer him, and he had to close his business. But most patent holders will give you a license. However, for most of us, we'd have to pay a lot of money to get it. But there are some privileged patent holders who won't have to pay so much. In fact, they may not have to pay anything. Those are the megacorporations. In any field, the megacorporations own around half the patents. And they cross-license each other, and they make a sort of exclusive club. Their club is a castle on the top of a mountain peak, and we, all the rest of us, are down at the bottom. And there's no way even an Edison can get up there. Because they don't have hundreds of patents, they have thousands of patents. So, it's easy for IBM to get a patent license. It just says, well, we have a lot of patents who want to cross-license with us, and just about everybody does. And this phenomenon, cross-licensing, is crucial to understanding the real effects of the patent system. The proponents of software patents pretend that software patents will help the small inventor by, quote, protecting him, unquote, from competition from big companies like IBM. And for this argument, they present a scenario of a starving genius, which is a series of improbabilities. It's so unlikely that it doesn't matter anyway. Let's look at this. Supposedly there's a brilliant designer of whatever it is who's come up with a better way to make something, so he decides to start a business. And because his idea is so good, his business would inevitably be a great success, except that big companies will compete with him and will take all of the business away, leaving him with zero, and his business will fail because of that, and he'll starve. This is ridiculously unlikely. First of all, for the most part, progress in high-tech fields is not made by somebody in isolation, but rather by people actually doing work together with other people. Second, supposing he has a good idea and puts that into combination with thousands of other ideas to make a good product, that doesn't mean his business is going to succeed. just because he's a genius at engineering doesn't mean he can run a business properly. Probably he can't. Most new businesses fail in a few years, like 90% or so. So his business is probably going to fail anyway. But suppose he's good at running a business as well. His business might succeed. Not all new businesses fail, obviously, a few succeed. But suppose he does know how to run a business. Well, the fact that there are big companies that might compete with him doesn't guarantee failure. There are ways that small companies have some advantages. If he knows how to run a business, he wouldn't go head-to-head with big businesses. Instead, he would go around the side and do various things that are not so easy for them. And so he would have some business despite having some competition. But supposing his business fails anyway, if he's a brilliant engineer and is good at running a business, he's not going to starve. Somebody's going to hire him. So it's a series of improbabilities, but let's consider it anyway, because their argument is the patent system will, quote, protect, unquote, him. He gets a patent, and then when IBM wants to compete with him, he says, IBM, you can't compete with me, I've got this patent. And IBM says, oh no, not again. But here's what really happens. IBM says, oh, you have a patent, how nice. We have this patent, this patent, this patent, this patent, and this patent that all cover various aspects of your product, because your product has lots of other ideas in it besides your new brilliant idea, and we patented some of them. And if you think you can fight those patents, we'll pull some more out of our portfolio. So why don't you sign a cross-license with us, and then nobody will get hurt. Now, by assumption, our genius understands business well. So he realizes he has no choice. He has to sign the cross-license agreement, which, as IBM put it, gives IBM access to the patents of others. IBM can compete with him just as if he had never got a patent. Which means that the patent system doesn't do the job it's supposed to do. It does not protect him against IBM. Maybe it gives him a way to shut down you or me if we try to compete with him, but not IBM. Of course, competition from you or me wouldn't be a big threat to him. We'd be other small companies. What's the threat he supposedly needs to be, quote, protected from, unquote, is a big company, and those are precisely the ones that can make him cross-license. So, the patent system is not effective for that job. Now, there are some patent holders even IBM can't force to cross-license, namely patent trolls. Those are the companies that don't produce anything except threats. They have patents, and they go around threatening companies that really try to make something, threatening them with lawsuits. Now, patent lawyers, although they say that we should be very glad to have patents in our field, have made sure that they are safe from patents. There are no patents on how to send a threatening letter, or how to file a lawsuit, or how to persuade a judge or a jury. So even IBM can't get any patents to threaten the lawyers with, and the patent troll is just lawyers. And all it does is make these threats and maybe sue. So the patent troll is immune. But IBM figures paying the trolls is just part of the cost of doing business. Its competitors will have to pay the trolls too. So IBM figures that overall it benefits. It's the mega corporations that mainly benefit from software patents. And it's the mega corporations that typically lobby for software patents. Now, getting a license for a software patent if you're not a mega corporation can be expensive. For the natural order recalculation patent, they were asking for 5% of the gross sales price of every spreadsheet sold in the US. Maybe you could pay for one such license if you're in business. But what happens when you need 20 of them? And then what happens when patent holder number 21 comes along and asks you to pay 105% of your sales price? Well, obviously, that would be impossible, but this is just an extreme joke. People in business told me that in practice, 2 or 3 such licenses would make a business fail. Meanwhile, there are some software developers who have a special difficulty getting patent licenses, namely those of us who write free software, free as in freedom, because the usual terms for a patent license will demand payment per copy, and we can't count the copies. Even if somebody offered me a license at the price of $1,000,000th per copy, I couldn't fulfill that commitment, because even though the total amount of money might be in my pocket now, it might be a few dollars, but I can't compute how much, so there's just nothing I can do. Of course, and so I could ask the patent holder, would you accept a single lump sum payment? Well, sometimes they do, but it tends to be $100,000, and I couldn't afford that. I can afford to spend time trying to make something useful for the public, but if I have to pay a lot of money to be permitted to do so, I can't. So that's the possibility of getting a license for the patent. Sometimes impossible, sometimes painfully expensive, unless you're a mega corporation. The third possibility is to invalidate the patent. To have a chance of doing that and succeeding, you need to have an argument that could prove your case, which means that you need to be able to find proof that the idea in question was known to the public before the patent application, which is called prior art. It's not enough that that was true, you have to find proof today that it was true back then. And often that's not easy to do. For instance, for the patent about putting a number of machines on a network and putting a number of games on each one, it would be hard to find proof anybody did that, because if someone did in the 1980s, it wouldn't have been worth writing about. So how are you going to find proof? There are lots of ideas that are worth patenting, but they're so trivial that they're not worth publishing an article about. Now, assuming you've got an argument, then you have to do a lawsuit, which can be quite expensive. That guy didn't have enough money to defend the lawsuit, so he had to shut his business. Even a probably invalid software patent is an extremely dangerous weapon when it's used to attack somebody who hasn't got a lot of money to resist with. So these are the 3 possible ways of dealing with a patent that threatens your program. And each one of them might or might not be possible based on different specific factors. So sometimes none of them is possible and your project is dead. But in practice, you don't know whether your project's going to be dead, because in some countries, in particular in the US, the penalty for infringing a patent is much greater if you knew about it. So the lawyers say, keep your eyes shut. Don't find out about any patents because you'll be increasing your vulnerability. Instead, just start designing your program and hope. So with each design decision, you might step on a patent, which could eventually explode and destroy your project. But you don't find this out until later, once your program is released. And at that point, eventually somebody comes along and says, I have a patent, I'm attacking you. And once you've dealt with him one way or another, another comes along and says, I have another patent, I'm attacking you. And someone else says, oh, I've got a patent too, I'm attacking you. And you never know how many more there are going to be. So it makes software development like crossing a minefield. With each step, with each design decision, probably nothing bad happens. But there's a chance you'll step on a patent which will explode and destroy your project. However, this analogy is not perfect. Once somebody has stepped on a landmine, it's not dangerous anymore. But one software patent can explode any number of times and destroy any number of software projects. Now, sometimes people respond to this point that software patents make software development dangerous and are just gumming up the works of everything, by saying other fields have dealt with patents for many decades and they survived, so why should software be an exception? Now, that's a ridiculous question because it's based on the supposition that we have to justify not having patents, that there's some reason why we should be treated like every other field. Actually, I think each field should be treated in whatever way is good in that field. There's no reason to have an a priori presupposition one way or the other. We should look at each field and do what's right. And in fact, his question is like saying, I know other people who got cancer, why shouldn't you? Well, I think every time there's somebody who doesn't get cancer, that's good, independent of what happens to anybody else. But there is a meaningful and valid question, which we can extract from that tendentious question, and it is, what difference is there between fields that would lead to choosing different patent policies in these fields? And there's a very big and important difference. How many patents typically cover one product? That's a spectrum, and different fields occupy different regions of this spectrum. At this extreme, there is one patent per product. That extreme may have corresponded to a lot of products 200 years ago. But nowadays, no field is like that. However, a lot of people still mistakenly imagine the patent system this way. They imagine that if you design a product, that if it's a new product, then you could get the patent covering that design. And obviously, since it's a new design, somebody else can't already have patented it. But you see, that language involves false assumptions about how the patent system works. A patent doesn't cover the design of a product, it covers an idea. And the design for a product implements many ideas together. And several of them might be patented. So you could design a new product and find you can't make it because it's patented by others already. Now, a few decades ago, the pharmaceutical field used to fit this. because every patent covered just one drug. And as a result, if you discovered a new drug, it wasn't patented already. But that's not true anymore. There are now broader patents. And as a result, a new drug can be already patented, already covered by several existing patents. So the pharmaceutical field has moved away from this extreme limit of one patent per product. It's now sort of over here. But it can't go very far away because we don't yet know how to combine lots of ideas in one drug. It's hard to combine just a few of them and make it work because we're still in the early stages of biological engineering. At the other extreme is software. In software, we can combine more ideas in one product than in any other field. And the reason is software is inherently easier. What we're doing is making mathematical structures that combine, that are made out of pieces with a definition. And as a result, we can make structures in the air that are supported by a thin mathematical line. And they stay up because they don't weigh anything. We don't have to deal with the perversity of matter, which every other field has to, because they're making physical things. And physical things encounter the perversity of matter, which is what makes them hard. Even a structure with a few design elements may be hard to get working. So, for instance, if I put an if statement inside of a for loop, I don't have to worry that the frequency of repetition of this for loop may be just wrong, and the if statement might resonate and eventually shake and crack. I don't have to worry that it might go much faster than that and it will induce radio frequency signals in some other part of the program. I don't have to worry that some corrosive fluid from the environment will get in between the if statement and the for statement and eat away at the connections until the data doesn't pass anymore. I don't have to worry about how the heat produced by the if statement will get out through the for statement so that it doesn't burn up. I don't have to worry about whether the voltage drop through the for statement will be so much that the voltage that the if statement gets is too little and it won't operate properly. I don't have to worry about what I'm going to do supposing the if statement burns out or cracks or corrodes, to pull it out and put in another if statement. I don't have to worry about how in manufacturing copies of this program I am going to physically assemble the if statement inside this for statement. If I want to make copies of this program, I just type copy. It's a universal factory for copies of any program. Or maybe I might want to use DD. Or maybe I just want to send a master. Maybe I want to burn a CD and send it to somebody who has a factory to make CDs that copy whatever I send him. It's not necessary to build a factory to make this product, which sometimes is necessary for physical products. You have to design the product so that you could design a factory to make it. And that may be harder and more constraining than the product's its own design. But we don't have any of those problems because what we're designing is purely mathematical in its structure. And this makes our field so easy that we can do much bigger projects than anybody else. After all, the range of intelligence for engineers is the same in all these fields. When people have a fundamentally easier kind of job to do, they can do bigger jobs. And that's why in software it's common to develop megastructures, things with millions of different elements in their design. That's normal. That would be a program with a few 100,000 lines of code. That's something a few people do in a few years. It's not a tremendous or unusual job. But a structure with a million non-repeating, that is, a million distinct design elements in it, that's a very big project if it has to be built physically. So the result is, we can put together more patented ideas in one project than anybody else can. And thus, and we can do this with much less money than they would need in the other fields. So as a result, whereas they might make structures with a lot fewer ideas, and they are bigger companies anyway, and maybe they can deal with the problems of the patent system, but in our field we can't. So this is a difference between fields that calls for different patent policy. But ultimately, programmers have ideas when they develop software. The way to get the most new ideas for what to do in software is to have lots of people making software. So a policy designed to explicitly encourage publication of new ideas which people won't be able to use for 20 years at the cost of making software development dangerous is self-defeating. Having the ideas is not the hard part. Implementing many ideas in combination, that's the hard part. So we can explain to non-programmers why software patents are so harmful by making an analogy with some other kind of work which implements a lot of ideas together. For instance, symphonies or novels. A symphony involves a lot of notes, and these notes implement musical ideas. But it's not enough to pick some musical ideas and say, take these ideas, it's a symphony. No, you have to implement them. That's what makes it hard. That's what most of us don't know how to do. So you implement these ideas by writing lots of notes that implement them. But the hard part is to implement them in a way that sounds good and fits together. And that's what certain people can do, and those are the good composers. So imagine if in the 1700s the governments of Europe had decided to promote the progress of symphonic music by allowing musical idea patents, so that any musical idea describable in words could have been patented. So, for instance, a certain melodic motif could be patented, or a rhythmic pattern could be patented, or a series of chords could be patented, or a form of repetitions for a movement could be patented, or using a certain set of instruments together without the others for either for the whole piece or for a short time could have been patented, and any other musical idea could have been patented. Now imagine it's 1800 and you're Beethoven and you want to write a symphony. You'd find it harder to write a symphony you don't get sued for than to write a symphony that sounds good. And if you complained, which if you were Beethoven I think you would have done, the patent holders would say, oh Beethoven, you're jealous because we had these ideas before you. Why don't you go think of some new ideas? Which would have been utterly absurd. Beethoven was quite capable of having new musical ideas. That's why he's considered a great composer, because he had so many new musical ideas. And he also, but that wouldn't have been enough. it's also crucial that he knew the way to use them effectively, which was take a few new ideas and implement them together with a bunch of familiar ideas and make a piece that stretches people's envelope, but not so far that it just sounds totally alien and they won't listen. They might scream at the end of the concert, but they'll listen and eventually they'll get used to it, which is why his compositions don't seem shocking to us now, but they did seem radical at the time. But he combined his new ideas with plenty of familiar ideas to make something people could grow to understand. Not even a Beethoven can reinvent music from zero and make something that people will listen to. And no one is such a genius that he could reinvent computing from zero and make something that people are going to want to use. New ideas are useful when they're combined with enough of the familiar ideas. And that's exactly what the patent system doesn't let people do. So we have a system which is aimed at promoting something that's not central and works by sabotaging the central job we have to do in our field, which is developing software. It's stupid in its own terms, and there is economic research which shows both theoretically and practically that it's self-defeating. Theoretically, modeling shows that in a field with incremental innovation, the patent system can reduce the investment in research and development. And empirically, what's observed is that software patents caused a shift in investment from development to patenting. So it's a stupid policy, but it benefits the megacorporations. So the outcome is a measure of to what extent government is capable of adopting good policies and ignoring what the megacorporations demand. So that's basically that. Although this talk has not been about free software or GNU, I'd like to mention where you can get information about them. You can look at GNU.org, and you can look at FSF.org, and also there's the Free Software Foundation of Europe at FSFE.org. Both of those organizations would like your support. You can become a member, which is one way of supporting them. There's also a lot of work to be done. If you want to join the Free Software Foundation, I can accept your dues in cash, but you could also use the websites to join either one of them if you're willing to do e-commerce. And now, what time is it? So I think I do have time to auction the GNU and then for some questions. So I'm going to auction this GNU for the benefit of the Free Software Foundation. This is an adorable GNU which needs a home. And if you have a penguin, you must get a GNU because, as we all know, a penguin can't hardly do anything without a GNU. The FSF can accept payment either in cash or with a credit card. As long as it's the kind of credit card you could use to make a phone order. If it has to involve a communication with a chip to pay, we can't do that. Because all we'll be able to do is write down the info. And if you are the purchaser, I can sign either the card or the body. When you bid, please wave your arm and shout out the amount you're bidding you want me to notice. Okay, so I'm going to start at 20 euros. Do I get 20 euros?
Yep.
I've got 20 euros. Do I get 25?
Yep.
I've got 30. Do I get 35? I've got 30, do I get
35.
35, you said? I've got 35, do I get 40?
Yep.
You were first, I've got 40, do I get 45? I've got 45, do I get 50?
Yeah.
I've got 50, do I get 55? I've got 50, do I get 55? 55 euros for this adorable Do I get 55? Do I get 55? 55 euros to the Free Software Foundation to defend your freedom? Do I get 55? How much?
55.
I've got 55, do I get 60?
Yep.
I've got 60, do I get 65? I've got 60, do I get 65? I've got 60, do I get 65? 65 euros? I've got 65, do I get 70?
70.
I've got 70, do I get 75? I've got 70, do I get 75? How much?
75.
I've got 75, do I get 80? I've got 75, do I get 80?
80.
I've got 80, do I get 85? I've got 85, do I get 90? I've got 85, do I get 90? Do I get 90 here? I've got 90, do I get 95? 95, do I get 100? I've got 100, do I get 110? I've got 110, do I get 120? I've got 110, do I get 120? 120 euros for this adorable Do I get 120? I've got 120, do I get 130? I've got 120, do I get 130? Do I get 130 euros for this adorable Gadoo? 130 euros to the Free Software Foundation to defend your freedom? Do I get 130? Do I get 130? I've got 130, do I get 140? I've got 130, do I get 140 for this adorable canoe to the Free Software Foundation to defend your freedom? Last chance, do I get 140? Do I get 140? Going, gone for 130. Time for questions. I'm sort of deaf. Please speak loud and slowly so I can hear your question.
Have you ever been attacked on a patent for GNU Emacs?
I don't think, no, certainly not for GNU Emacs. No one has ever threatened us. But other free software projects have been threatened. For instance, Google is now being sued by Oracle, and this is about a free program, an implementation of Java, which is free software and is used in Android. And the developers of free software for MP3 audio format were threatened, and they weren't even the business, I believe. I think they were just volunteers who developed this program called Blade Encoder, and they were threatened, and they had to stop working on it. And today, many distributors of GNU/Linux distributions don't dare include MP3 support, which is why you shouldn't make MP3 files. If you distribute audio, distribute it in OGG Vorbis format. Other questions?
Yes. Do you think civil disobedience might be a solution to that problem? I mean, right away.
What exactly is civil disobedience? If it means developing some software and ignoring the fact that you're infringing patents, which you probably wouldn't know anyway in most cases, well, it's not worth calling that civil disobedience. That's just practicing software development.
Yes, but knowingly, I mean, purposefully infringing patents.
If you can get away with it, you should, because, at least if you're making free software, I think, but the problem is that can't fully solve the problem. As long as you're small enough, yes, they won't notice you. They probably won't bother you. But when they actually threaten to sue you, you will probably find you have to stop.
No, the point would be to be sued and provoke a response and provoke it enough and enough and enough until the system just gets...
Well, if you don't have enough money for them to be able to get anything out of you by suing you, they might leave you alone. If they had to sue a lot of people who didn't have much money, they might give up. On the other hand, they might order some governments to adopt nastier laws to make it easier for them to sue and crush a lot of people.
You made a very interesting explanation of the patent system. As you know, in Europe, the patent system for the patent for software or computer-supported invention, I think this is the official word, were killed by the European Parliament a few years ago. So
Yes, but the European Patent Office issues software patents anyway, distorting the treaty that set it up.
well,
And so there's a very important organization called FFII. And in its website, ffii.org, you can find an image that says, your web shop is patented. And it shows an imaginary website with various things that are common in websites, and pointing at them and saying, this is EPO patent number such and such, which forbids this and that and that. There are around 10 to 20 different things on there labeled with the absurd patents that the EPO is issued in contempt for the treaty that set it up.
so you say that there is no basic difference between the American legal system and the European legal
Well, there
system?
certainly are some differences, and I don't know all about them. In the U.S., a patent application can be secret for any amount of time if it's only being done in the U.S. Whereas in European countries, if I understand right, it will be published in 18 months. So that's one difference where Europe is a little better. Also, in the U.S., if the patent's issuance is delayed, it still lasts for 17 years after that, at least. Whereas in Europe, it can't ever last beyond 20 years after the date of application, which is another superiority of Europe. But these superiorities don't make the problem cease to be a problem.
You talked about patent trolling. Now, if you would combine the idea of patent trolling with open sourcing, shouldn't...
Well, I've never been in favor of open source, so I can only respond to that by saying what I just said.
Yeah, but I mean, if you say, okay, some organization who acquires patents but doesn't develop, gives these patents publicly available to anyone who...
Well, the problem with that is it costs a lot of money to buy those patents. Who is going to... Sure, if there were some great benefactor who wanted to buy up patents that threatened us and then say that they can't be used to attack, well, then that would be great. But how do we convince anyone with that much money to do something to help this problem?
So what can we do, or should we do against?
You have to organize to make sure the governments of various European countries do not allow software patents to have validity.
Yeah, you explained that, for example, MP3 and fax or GIF are patented.
Static GIFs are safe now. Those patents have expired.
Okay.
MP3 is still dangerous. And the MPEG video formats are still dangerous.
Okay, so that means that they actually patent a specific algorithm, a specific
No.
series of instructions that you can...
No, the patents are not that specific. The reason that there are 37 different patents in the US covering MPEG-2 format is that each of these patents covers just a certain part of the job to be done in a somewhat general fashion.
But, okay, so I could even patent the idea of including software inside other software.
Well,
I could,
at one point you could have, but that patent that patent ought to be invalid today because that idea has been known.
okay.
So,
I can,
unless the patent office made a mistake, it would refuse to let someone patent that. Of course, those mistakes do happen.
because I don't think that someone ever went to a patent office and said, I invented include stdio.h.
Probably not. On the other hand, if that was an example of it, we could show a copy of K&R as proof that this idea was known in the 1970s and 80s.
Okay.
What do you find the most annoyingly convincing argument from the other side?
Sorry, I have no answer for that. It's not my job to argue for the other side.
Did you see an improvement on the European Union point of view of the patent system that is like improving the way of managing this to a
Well,
patent?
I don't know of any change in the past few years. As far as I know, the situation is the same. The EPO keeps on issuing at least tens of thousands of software patents. And there was someone here from FF. Oh, Kieran would know something maybe.
Yeah, actually the situation is getting a little worse now because the European Union is proposing to create a new court, and this will be used to decide litigation for patents in multiple countries. This is the Unified Patent, it's called. And the problem is that this court will be under the control of the European Patent Office. So instead of the current situation where a patent dispute goes to a national court, in the future, patent disputes will go to a court that is under the control of the European Patent Office. So the European Patent Office will ignore the law, ignore the treaties, and will grant software patents, and their court will uphold these patents. So the legislation is not being changed, however the system is being changed so that the legislation will not be applicable and the software patents will become enforceable or more enforceable in Europe. So,
Is the directive for this?
it's not yet a directive. There was an approval vote last week in the Parliament. It's generally just called the unitary patent. It was previously called the community patent, and it's had about 5 different names. It's actually been in progress for 10 years now in the current form, 45 years in a previous form. So there will be 3 directives, as far as I know, directives or regulations to implement this new court, which will apply to 12 member states initially, and it will expand from there. We've already tried talking to the Parliament, members of Parliament, and we will continue talking to them, but we need more support and we need more people talking to the people in the Parliament. So there are organisations, there's FFII, I also work for End Software Patents, and we're working on this. April is working on this in France. Le Quadrature, I think, is working on this, and well, there are various organisations, but so help with this is necessary.
Want to state the websites of these?
So FFII, FFII.org, End Software Patents, endsoftwarepatents.org.
Can you say that slowly and clearly?
endsoftwarepatents.org, ffii.org, april.org, and La Quadrature is .fo or
I
.org?
think it's .net.
.net. And the proposal is called the unitary patent. So this will be something we will work on in the next few weeks and months.
So you need to fight this.
Is there any specific field that you personally think that a patent is useful?
There are many fields about which I have no opinion. In fields of manufacturing and factories, patents don't affect so many people. And though I'm not an expert in those fields, I'd rather have no opinion. There are three areas where I see patents as causing problems, and they're different problems, different structurally. For instance, patents on pharmaceuticals are deadly. They cause at least thousands, if not millions, of deaths every year. Now, it may not be such a big problem in countries with a national health service that can afford the drugs and that negotiates a reasonable price for it. In the US, where we don't have that, I saw an estimate that 45,000 people die each year because they can't afford the diagnosis or treatment. Well, for some of them that's treatment, and for some of them that's medicine, which they can't afford. I don't know how many that is. In poor countries, most people can't afford the medicines for a lot of diseases. And the European Union is actively trying to make that worse. The EU's trade treaty with India would destroy the Indian generic drugs industry and probably kill millions of people. Then another area is agriculture, where patents on plants or animals attack farmers' traditional freedom to breed their plants and animals. And so that's directly unjust. Those rights must be maintained. Any laws or treaties that obstruct those rights are unjust and must be abolished. And then there's the field of software, where the problem is different in structure again, but I've already explained it. So these are three different kinds of problems that come out of patent law in different fields.
What about searchable databases of prior art? Would that be
Sorry, that wouldn't help very much. That would enable us to get rid of some patents, which is like if you could cause some of the mines in a minefield to self-destruct. Well, yes, it's a step forward, but that doesn't make it safe to cross. So basically, that's a distraction. And I find that software developers keep trying to look for some sort of half measure that will make a little improvement instead of the much easier things that could give us victory.
Can you talk a bit about the Bilski case in the US?
Well, it ultimately, the Supreme Court ultimately made a decision which only concerned itself with details of certain criteria and really affected nothing.
Explain, do you know what the patent was about?
No, I don't. But it's not important. What I'm telling you is it was a lot of noise and ended up making almost no difference. If the court had decided differently, it might have abolished a large part of software patents, but it didn't.
So the European Patent Convention says that computer programs are excluded from the list, but the EPO and certain courts still
Right,
interpret that exclusion.
They have a twisted way of interpreting that language.
So what do you propose to make the twist be possible and the exclusion
Well,
more resistant?
FFII worked on language for this. So you should take, I don't remember it anymore. I know the issue is tricky because, for instance, the directive that was rejected several years ago superficially looked like it was doing the right thing. Superficially looked like it would allow patents for physical systems which had hardware in, had some software in them, but wouldn't allow patents on just software as such. But lawyers pointed out how it would actually be interpreted in courts as admitting software patents. So here the problem is trying to outfox a system of dishonest law where the people with the money to pay the lawyers and the EPO would certainly try to distort whatever law is adopted so that it would give the same bad result as today. And I'm pretty sure that FFII could still give you the details of the analysis of that directive and what was proposed. Because there were many amendments that were proposed to fix it. Other questions, or are we done?
Would an exception for interoperability be useful?
It wouldn't make a difference because it would, if it were enough, again, it would depend on how that would actually be interpreted by courts. But if it meant that we could safely implement MP3 and MPEG-2 and GIF in the past, that would have made a lot of difference. One question would be, what would it imply for Oracle versus Google? After all, Google is implementing interoperability for Java programs. So you have to compare some proposed criterion against the real issues that are arising. But not every patent problem relates to interoperability or directly. A lawyer did a study of one particular free program, namely Linux, the kernel of the GNU plus Linux system. And he found 283 different US patents, each of which appears to prohibit some computation done in Linux. Well, he didn't publish a list of those patents because he didn't want to hurt the legal standing of the developers of Linux. But I would expect that not all of those patents had to do directly with using some standard data format. In fact, how many different, well, there are a few things that kernels do that have to do with interoperability, like implementing TCP/IP and implementing certain disk file system formats and reading executable files. Well, those are standards, so I guess you could argue based on interoperability. But most of what's done inside a kernel isn't directly about implementing those formats and protocols. So I would expect that most of those patents would not have benefited from the incompatibility issue, from the interoperability issue. The natural order recalculation patent would not have been affected by that. So that wouldn't help. The patent on defining abbreves it wouldn't help for that. And to a large extent, though, it might be a matter where courts could interpret it in various ways and you couldn't predict. I suppose a certain idea has to be implemented in order to support a certain widely used programming language. But it's not directly in the spec, it's just the only practical way to do it. So then, does the interoperability exception cover this or not? I don't know, it depends. It would depend on precisely how that exception were written, and then on how a court would interpret it on the basis of other laws. And of course it would depend on whether that court was rigged by the EPO to give the answer, this patent is valid.
How could one justify the use of a non-patented product versus a patented product when the patented product is in benchmarks seriously better?
Well, it can be very easy. It depends what your values are and what you want in life. For me, well, the other thing is, you've raised a question I'm not sure is relevant. You're talking about using a patented or a non-patented product. Remember, it's not, products are not directly patented. What gets patented is an idea. So, and the developers of a program don't generally know whether it infringes patents, and there's no way we would know either. So I never said that you should carefully choose the products that don't infringe patents, or that don't have any patents that apparently cover and forbid them. I don't suggest that. How would you know? In certain specific cases, I ask people to avoid certain standards, certain formats, for instance, which we know are patented, and not only that, which we know those patents have been used to attack free software developers. For instance, I say, don't make MP3 files. Never. And the reason is, if you make an MP3 file, you're putting someone else, if you ever give that file to somebody else, you've put him in a position where he is pressured to use the authorized and non-free players, and he may have trouble finding the free software to play it with. So that's why you shouldn't make him distribute MP3 files. But I wouldn't suggest that in general you should check every product to see if it infringes any patents. You couldn't, and it would be a waste of time to do it anyway. That's not the point where you should make your choices.
When you were talking about analogies, to explain to people who don't know software, it struck to me that you compare them with symphonies, novels, and it's all forms of art.
Right, they are art.
So I think you're saying that creating software is an art.
No, I'm not.
No. Okay.
That's irrelevant, actually. What's relevant is that in each of these categories, a work tends to be large and implements many ideas together. However, to write a good work, it's not enough to pick a few ideas, because the hard job is to implement them together well and make a good work that is good because it has these ideas in it, but also because every detail of it has been made to fit in harmoniously. So you can't just pick 10 ideas and say, put these ideas together, now you've got a novel. No, you have to write the novel. And the novel might embody those 10 ideas, but that's not enough to make it a good novel. The ability to pick a few ideas doesn't mean you can write a good novel. You have to know how to write well also. So that's the similarity between programs and novels and symphonies. And that is enough structural similarity that the problem would be the same in these 3 areas.
Android is based on free software, but is a monopoly. How can you fight?
Well, I don't know what that means. It's not a monopoly, really.
How can you fight software patents and avoid anti-competitive practices at the same time?
I just don't follow the connection between these 2 different things.
Is the question the connection?
I don't see a connection. I'm sorry. Well, a patent is a kind of anti-competitive practice, but I'm not sure which other anti-competitive practices you have in mind, and I don't know if they relate to the issue of software patents. So I'm a bit lost, is all I can say. The question is too broad and abstract for me to think about it. But regarding Android, Android is not a monopoly. In fact, many companies are putting versions of Android into phones. Android, as such, is free software. But these companies often put some non-free software into the phone along with Android. And, well, is that Android's fault? Partially it is. The license that Android uses is not a copyleft license, which means that Google explicitly permitted the other companies to make non-free modified versions of Android. So Android, as Google releases it, is free software. But Android, as it comes in a particular phone, may not be free software. Now, if I had written that software, I would have copylefted it, and I would have thus told those phone manufacturers, you can't do that. You've got to deliver it as free software to the users. But that's not what Google did. So,
imagine someone comes up with a new idea, I don't know, a new idea for indexing databases, but has no interest in starting a business. And you think that maybe you can patent it and license it to Oracle or Microsoft.
so then he'll be a patent troll.
Yeah, but is he thinking that he works a lot to come up with this idea?
So what? That's no excuse for sabotaging the rest of society.
I'm just...
What he thinks is not important. He's not important. Nobody's important enough to deserve this kind of power over other people. And patents are not justified by any kind of argument like that. Nobody is important enough that he's entitled to argue, I'm entitled to restrict and control and sabotage everybody else to get something for me just because I worked hard. That's just not a valid argument, and that's not the reason for patents. The reason for patents is to encourage people to come up with ideas and publish them.
And they're not a good enough way to do that.
It's not working very well. What happens is that these ideas either would have been published anyway, or they're obvious once you see anything that uses them, and thus we're not getting any benefit from having it be patented. And most of the details about how to really use the idea and have it work, they manage to keep secret. Patent lawyers nowadays are great at writing the patent so that it will cover a wide range of things people might do, but doesn't really suggest the best way to use the idea at all, so that that can be kept a secret at the same time. So the patent system is failing to achieve its intended purpose of discouraging trade secrecy. And you'll note that there are explicit laws to facilitate trade secrecy. So the government is doing these two apparently contradictory things. On the one hand, it helps the practice of trade secrecy and supports it. And on the other hand, it says trade secrecy is so harmful that we've got to discourage it by offering these monopolies instead. So this seems fishy to me. I would say it's sort of corrupt. The only way that this pair of policies would make sense is if you assume that the real goal is to help big businesses, one way or another.
I have a question about big business. You have probably talked with people coming from big corporations. And it's something I don't understand. So suppose I'm talking to someone from law, from a lawyer, and I'm trying to explain. So in my domain, computer science is nobody likes software patents. And then you say, okay, but I don't hear about it. Why don't you say more about this? And they say, okay, the big companies are like software patents, and the small ones, they don't have voice, so we don't hear about it. But I don't really like this explanation, because for me, for Google, for example, a company like Google, for them I don't see the interest of having software patents.
Well, maybe Google doesn't, but of course
Yeah.
Google is probably trying to get patents right now.
Yeah, okay, and you can understand this, so it's getting patents for the defensive reason.
Well, of course, many companies start out by saying we want patents to defend ourselves. But unless the company is a giant, it's not likely to ever get enough patents that it can effectively defend itself. Now, Google can over time, because it's so big.
What I don't understand is why don't you see bigger companies
I don't know.
voicing against software patents?
I don't know.
This idea that I have is that they don't do it because they're afraid of patent office. They want to build their portfolios, and if they are against software patents,
I don't know if that's true.
Okay.
I don't know if that's true. But when Google said to the FSF, why don't you help us strongly by supporting our side against Oracle, we said, well, you know, we've been asking you for a couple of years to help us do more to fight against software patents, and you wouldn't help us until you were actually attacked. Well, we did condemn Oracle for those lawsuits, but at the same time we said that Google ought to do more to help the general issue instead of just asking us to help Google.
Maybe you see the light.
Well, I hope so.
Software patents aren't just putting normal developers at risk. I mean, if a government develops its own software, it is at risk of infringing software patents.
Yes.
So definitely ministries of all kinds who have developed their own software and are developing their own tools, they are at risk.
Yes, they are.
Do you get a response from such people?
I don't know. I don't get to talk to them very much. Maybe you can. Remember, there's a lot of work to be done, and I can only do a little bit of it.
Yeah,
You have got to join organizations like FFII and End Soft Patents and start campaigning here.
Yeah, we've got some elections somewhere this year, but I'm not sure that will be the heart of the topic.
Well, it will be if you raise the issue. There's a lot of work to be done. And so far we are few, but we managed to block one nasty directive. It can be done. So you've got to get working. We've got to block the next one, the one they're going to try to set up the community patent with. Are there more
Yeah, you have quite well illustrated the reason why software patent does not fulfill its initial duty. But do you think the concept of protection still makes sense?
Well, I don't like that term, protection. It's
I know.
totally
I
wrong.
know.
It doesn't agree with the intended purpose of the patent system. It's simply spin, so don't use it.
Okay, software patents, they do not protect, but maybe some people need protection. Do you
Well,
think there is some way to protect people?
The first step is don't have software patents. You see, you can't make patents last less than 20 years unless you have the courage to pull out of the World Trade Organization, which of course needs to be done. It needs to be done for other reasons as well. But while we build the demand for people to protest by their millions in the streets and say, destroy the WTO, it's impossible to have patents that last less than 20 years. So if we want to have anything else, say, suppose it were possible to have a monopoly for 3 years. That wouldn't, we could live with that. You know, you can wait 3 years to start doing something. So that would be tolerable, but it can't be a patent. It would have to be some other kind of legal privilege or monopoly. And so the first step is always get rid of software patents. And at that point, you know, I'm not convinced that there's a social need to have that kind of system. I think we'll be just fine with no monopoly interfering at all with software development. So I guess it's time to stop. Have you got the stuff set up for distribution?
If you give me a minute, I can help you set up.
Will that be outside?
Uh,
Because the room's got to be used at what time?
Yeah, we can set it up outside.
Yeah, because we've got stickers and also some gear for sale from the FSF. So how about if you take that stuff up there and set it up, and right away,